Should you get married young? Well, I got married at 19. Now, I'm not telling you that's what you should do. I'm just saying that's what I did. But I will tell you this. A lot of the reasons people gave me for why I shouldn't get married young were utter and complete garbage. I mean, just complete intellectual nonsense. Because when I let people know that at 19 I was about to propose to my girlfriend, a lot of people said I was crazy. We were too poor. We were too young. We didn't have a clue about what we really wanted. I was in the army and was going to travel. I needed to see the world and have some adventures before I settled down. All of these things were provided to me as evidence for why we shouldn't get married. And to give you an idea of just how dedicated certain people were to this proposition, we actually found out later that we had a couple of couples that were a little bit farther down the path than we were, who we invited to our wedding. And they took bets on our wedding at how long we would last. So here's the first question. If someone's going to tell you you're too young, well, then I guess the real question would be, great, what's the appropriate age? Now, obviously, there are ages that are too young to get married. But if all the people telling you you're too young are insistent that you're too young, you have every right to ask them, great, what's the proper age? And most time what you're going to find out is they don't have one, or you're going to get as many answers as you have people that you ask the question to. And maybe the reason why they don't have a good answer to the question is because it's not really about age as much as it is maturity. And the reality is this: there are a lot of people that shouldn't get married young, not because they're young, but because they're immature. By the same token, we all know people who are perfectly within the socially acceptable marrying age who also shouldn't get married because they lack maturity. Case in point, the very couples that we invited to our wedding that were betting against us, well, we're still married and they're divorced. Now, one of the other common things you will hear as a reason for why you shouldn't get married is because don't you want to go experience other people first? Now, I know what you're thinking. Did you really have people say this? A lot of them didn't come right out and say it. Maybe some of my army buddies, but there were a lot of people that might have suggested that going out there and having a couple of sexual conquests might be beneficial. That way I could know what I actually liked. Because after all, how could you know what you really liked if you hadn't run the gauntlet of cheap and meaningless sex with a bunch of people you weren't really interested in? Now, again, they want to come right out and say that, but that had been their experience. Presumably, they thought they knew what they wanted because they had a whole lot of what they didn't want. I know that there are going to be plenty of people responding to this telling me that I'm a prude or a Puritan, and they're glad that that approach worked for me, but that's not the case for everyone. And honestly, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't care. I think you're wrong. Because the idea that you need to play the field so you can know what it's like or determine if you're sexually compatible, I think is on its face intellectually absurd. Now, let me give you a story to illustrate this point. Because when I was a young specialist in the 82nd Airborne Division, I actually had a sergeant tell me that I had made a mistake getting married so young because didn't I know that studies had shown that married couples were actually happier if they had had some more experience, by that I mean sexual partners, before they got married. Now, first of all, I don't know what study that came from, but you should probably trash it instantly, because anyone who has really looked at this issue isn't going to tell you that racking up a body count of randos is going to facilitate greater intimacy in your relationship. But just to hammer the point home, I remember looking back at him and saying, well, Sergeant, if that's true, then what you're telling me is that when you and your wife are being intimate and your wife does something that you really like, you think to yourself, boy, I should really send a thank you note to whatever random dude taught her how to do that. Is that how you feel? I'm sure it doesn't come as much of a shock that when his sage advice on marital bliss was repeated back to him in those terms, he didn't like it very much. In fact, I believe the phrase he used was, "That's effed up, Freitas." To which I responded, well, Sergeant, if you don't like it, don't make stupid claims that are so easily refuted by simply asking you a simple question on how you would feel about that. Because the idea that what a guy actually wants in a wife is someone that has been through a bunch of guys other than him is on its face ridiculous. But it's the same thing when you actually ask women. The idea that what a good woman really wants is some Casanova that has spent a good portion of his life running through everything that walked in the club is a fairy tale made by crappy men for other crappy men. A woman in a loving relationship with a guy who didn't do that is a woman that doesn't feel compared to a number of faceless women every time her husband closes his eyes. In a world where women see sex not just as a physical act, but as a heavily emotional and vulnerable one, Knowing that her husband is hers and hers alone is an incredible advantage in your marriage, not a drawback. Now, finally, there were some people that said, well, the real problem here, Nick, is that you need to live some life. You need to get out there, have some experiences, have some adventures before you settle down. I always thought about that, right? Before you settle down. You know, it's not hard to see why the people giving you this advice are usually not very happy in their own marriages. And quite frankly, they probably shouldn't be giving a whole lot of advice to others. Because the mentality that marriage is the end of the adventure instead of the beginning of it is probably a huge problem in their relationship. In the 24 years I have been married to my wife, we have dealt with a lot of difficulties. Combat deployments, moving 12 times, a global pandemic, losing a job unexpectedly, having our house broken into and our identity stolen. The first 10 years of marriage, I was gone for 5 of them because of the military. All of these things are incredibly stressful on a marriage. But we've also watched the birth of our 3 children. We've ran for office together. We've started a business together. We got to see the look on our children's face the first time they saw Disneyland. We have talked each other into dogs and then kittens and then chickens and then goats. And if I'm being honest, there's probably a lot of other livestock on the way at some point. But the point is that we've dreamed together, we've cried together, we have failed together, and we have triumphed together. To the point where I remember someone a while back asking me where my hometown was, where my home was. And I told them with absolute conviction that it's wherever Tina is. Because I never doubted that there was going to be adventures in life and there was going to be difficulties in life. And quite frankly, that's why I wanted to marry her, and that's why I couldn't wait to marry her. Because I couldn't imagine experiencing those things without her. I can't imagine how much time I would have lost and how many experiences would have been cheapened because she wouldn't have been there. Marriage was definitely not the end of the adventure for me. It's the start of it. And it's been ongoing ever since. So, if you are a young person that wants to get married, there are some things that you should do relatively soon in the process, as soon as you start to think it's even a possibility. And it should always begin with having very honest conversations about important things way before you get emotionally connected. Now, there will be some people that say that can wait. You let the relationship develop. I'm telling you right now, if you really care about someone, don't waste their time. Don't play with their heart, and don't tolerate other people doing the same thing to you. If this isn't someone that you can actually conceive of yourself being married to, then don't create a bunch of cheapened experiences, which is going to adversely affect the real experiences that you want to have with the woman that you love. Tina and I spent time discussing things that actually mattered very early on. We talked about faith. We talked about worldview. We talked about concepts of right and wrong, problem solving. We talked about the ideas about our roles and responsibilities of a wife and a husband. Who should be the primary breadwinner? Did she want to work outside the home? What would that look like when we had kids? By the way, how many kids do you want to have? How do we plan to raise them, discipline them, encourage them? We discussed our views on decision making. We talked about our pet peeves. And in all of these discussions, we chose to be open and honest with one another about what we wanted because there was only 2 possible outcomes from these conversations. We were either going to learn that we had very different ideas about the world and the roles that we were going to play in it, and therefore marriage was not a possibility. Or we were going to find out that the natural attraction that we had for one another rested on something strong enough to build a marriage. Now again, some people will tell you it's fine to wait to ask these questions till after you're married, and I will tell you right now that's a huge problem because a lot of those people seem to think that the marriage is the wedding, but it isn't. It's everything that happens afterward. And just as a happy marriage can be one of the best things that you will ever experience, a bad one, I can only imagine, feels like a prison. So ask the important questions up front. So, am I telling you to get married young? Not necessarily. I am saying that marriage is more about maturity than it is age. I am saying that you probably shouldn't take too much advice from people unhappy in their own marriage because if their advice worked, well then presumably it would have worked for them. And what I am saying is when you find someone that you truly love and admire and they feel the same about you, to hold off getting married so you can engage in a bunch of meaningless trysts or side quests is to not only delay the real adventure that you could be having with the person that you love, you actually risk losing it altogether when he or she decides that they don't want to wait for you to grow up.